Yeah, I feel like New York is my home. I think New York is my home for sure. Uh, I mean, 10 years. Like my life has changed so much in 10 years. Um, but like that question you said, like, what do you think of when you hear the word home? I think of Minneapolis for sure. Um, and I think New York is home in the sense of I feel like there are a few places are my home. I feel like there's more than one place that is my home, and I think that's something I had to come to grips with also when leaving Minneapolis. It was like I wanted to still be so much a part of the community, and I think I am. And I continue to do my work in certain ways, but I don't live there. I've realized that all those places are my home. And I like that. I like that feeling. When I hear the word home, I think of I think of community service. Um, Largely, I think of community service and then community support as far as like community being there for me because that's how I grew up. You know, Cedar Riverside, growing up in that area, South Minneapolis was what it was all about. The Brian Coyle Center was a community center that was directly across the street from uh, the building I grew up in, E Building, part of the Riverside Plaza. E Building, my apartment that we grew up in 1908. I would leave home and I went there, and my life circulated around that whole area um, up until I was probably 9 or 10. You know what I mean? And even after we moved from the area to another part of Minneapolis, Northeast Minneapolis, um, we would go back. I think about that. I think about that place and how it shaped me and the people who I met there who are still a part of my life or even not around today, Um, my godmother. My godmother, I met my godmother at the Brian Coyle Center. A pivotal point in my life and a pivotal person to me who has done so much to make sure that I was going for the things that I saw myself being a part of. And also, even if I didn't see the things, it was seeing things that weren't even there. She was someone who sparked that creativity and those thoughts in my head. So shout out to Jessica Rogers, man. I love that woman. A lot of what's going on isn't new. The magnitude of this is grown. It's massive now, but I've seen a lot of this stuff growing up in Minneapolis, and also kind of been victim to it as well. So inside, I wanna do something urgently. And I think about the time, when a few years ago when George Floyd was killed. Um, you know, it affected me so much emotionally. Like, man, it's so interesting to think about it now. Like, it really brought me. Like, I remember there was a point like I got on the phone with a friend of mine, and we talked. I don't know if I called him or if he called me, and I just remember I started crying, and I just like, man, they're burning the city. I was like, I can't. I'm like, I couldn't like seeing it with my own eyes on television. I just was like, wow. Like, I rode my bike up and down those streets and that block and things like that, and to see it being burnt down, it was so emotional. Um, and even to the point where recently, I spoke to a friend of my godmother's, and she sent me a video of Minneapolis, an old video of Minneapolis back in the day, and I was like, oh man, I was like, I miss it. Like it changed. I was like, they ruined it. I said that to her. I was like, they ruined it. And she was like, yeah, she's like, I feel the same way. She's like, but change is inevitable. And I agree. But I think I meant something different. I said they ruined it, not that they changed it or it's changed. And I think like that's what hurts the most. It's like, it's not going through a change. It's like, this is a purposeful act that's going on. You know what I mean? This is not, it's not just change. And I think like in the same way of someone dies or they get slain, it's like a Biggie or a Tupac. I remember like when they died, like, or Aaliyah dying in an airplane. Like it was like, damn. It's like that wasn't supposed to happen. You know what I mean? Like that shouldn't have happened to them. And obviously, it being at the hands of someone or tragic, it's like one of those things. That's kind of how I felt. I was just like, it didn't have to change like this. What's going on now, and how the Minneapolis residents are coming together and standing up and making their voices be heard and fighting back. That is progressive. That's something that prior to George Floyd being killed, you know what I mean? Like, there was a lot of times where I didn't feel that way. I felt like, you could be going through a situation like that and you may not get, somebody might not come to your aid. You know what I mean? It hurts to see a lot of what's going on, for real. It does. But, that's why, I want to continue to stay active. I want to continue to stay active because, like mentioning, during the time when George Floyd was killed, I was able to almost add a different look to what it felt like to be a part of the community there. It has changed, and I almost forgot, like, what is my role? Not that I need a role, but like, what is my involvement in the community there now? And getting vocal here, it's like I combined the communities. My support system here, they felt me, enough in a way where they were like, man, I feel for you and I want to help. And I was able to, like, I think I mentioned to you, I was able to raise some funds and give back and donate to some of those areas that were burned down and that were going through the hardest times there. I went and we passed out food. I donated to some friends who were doing some really, really powerful things there. Not just organizations that were being highlighted on the news and things like that, but like people who I knew were doing some real good work, and some artists as well. And we created the initiative Defend Minneapolis, and I was like, wow. I was like, it felt so good because I was like, yeah, like that's that's the community. That's what I was doing in Brian Coyle Center. That was sparked in me then. That type of work, that type of community work was that fire was lit in me then, and 10, 15 plus years later, I'm able to see the benefits of that community, even removed. My view on Minneapolis, Minneapolis is small, but inside of there, there's a lot going on, and I think early on, it was like me coming to New York. I was like, man, I say it in songs too. I was like, Brooklyn ain't no different than Minneapolis. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like if I could make it through what I made through there, I could definitely do it in Brooklyn. Even though I know people are like, if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. It was my take on it was a little bit different. Yeah, Minnesota is a migrant state, but definitely the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, like it's a migrant city. Those cities are migrant cities. People from the South, people from the Americas are traveling from the South have went up there. That's how my parents got there. But then obviously the Somali community, the Ethiopian community, Eritrean, Norwegian, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's a lot. all those people made Minneapolis what it is. And I think, so my memories of Minneapolis and doing my research on New York City, and not just Brooklyn, but New York City, I was like, what's the difference?
Mm.
You know what I mean? I'm like, New York was a free man's land, you know? I did a lot of research on New York before I moved here. And even being here, like I did a lot of research, but I do know that for sure. It's like, who's from here? Some would say I'm a New Yorker. Some would say I'm a New Yorker. Some wouldn't. You know what I mean? I love New York City though, man. I love Brooklyn for real, for real.